Unfiltered, uncensored, and unapologetic. This is the Retail Warzone podcast.
Tonight, we have with us Adam Ryan. Were you the creator of Target Workers Unite, Adam?
Yeah, I'd say co-founder. I don't feel like I can say I take all credit, but I definitely played a integral role.
Gotcha. If you guys see on the screen, we've got their Twitter handle there at TGT Workers Unite, and then we also have their website, targetworkersunite.com. So, Adam, thanks for being here tonight. So what I'd like to do is, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in labor inequalities and organizing.
Yeah. Born and raised in this area that I'm in now, New River Valley, which is comprised of about 4 counties and a few small towns, 2 big colleges. Virginia Tech's probably the most well-known feature around here. But yeah, in terms of how I got into labor organizing and stuff like that, I didn't really start thinking about like organizing until maybe 2011 or so, like around there, and actually got involved with a newly chartered Industrial Workers of the World chapter established in Richmond, Virginia, and they're kind of a lesser known union these days. They have a very rich history, very radical history, very explicitly anti-capitalist, and many great historical figures have come through there who've done some pretty heroic labor actions and strikes, fighting issues like, segregation, equality between, workers, men workers and women workers, immigrant workers and non-immigrant workers. They were on the forefront of fighting all these different types of discrimination that a lot of the unions at the time were actually enforcing and being against. So the IWW still has that very strong history. And anyways, I got involved with them. Went through an organizer training that they have, which is really good. I always like to tell people it's the best in the country if you're trying to figure out how to be a worker and organize as a worker. And I've gone to other organizer trainings with other more well-funded, well-known mainstream unions. And I still would say IWW has the best training. And they do them online now, so if you're wanting to get that, you can do it from your home. You probably need to be a member though, unless you might be involved with some independent organizing effort right now. Sometimes the IWW will help do those for free for certain campaigns and stuff.
So you got involved in this before you actually worked for Target, correct?
Yeah. That was kind of my first foray into labor organizing, the idea of organizing at the job and stuff like that. I didn't start at Target until 2017. There was I had a bunch of different experiences trying to organize on my own at different workplaces in Richmond and outside of Richmond. But I picked Target back in 2017 because I had recently come back to my hometown after living in Richmond for a while and organizing there, and started up an organizing project in my hometown. And that was a result of just doing some canvassing and door knocking and the trailer parks around here, talking to workers, hear about what issues were going on, and came up that the local boss at our local Target was known to be an abusive boss, creating a hostile work environment, sexually harassing women workers, making racist comments, pretty much everything Target, as a company, claims to be against. So I thought that would be a good opportunity to go and organize workers to hold this guy accountable. The workers at that store had tried to in the past, Target, like many other companies, have their own like internal HR channels they want you to go through to try to address these issues, even though a lot of times the procedure that they want you to go through really is just a way to expose yourself and put yourself out there to get retaliated against by the company. And that's what had happened to other workers who had tried to go through that process to hold this boss accountable. So we felt it was necessary to escalate to a strike action. And so then I went and got a job there to SALT, which is like a term used to describe where you're like an organizer going to work at a particular place to organize at. And so did that. And then in 4 months, we did a small strike action to hold that guy accountable. And we were successful in finally triggering an internal investigation within Target, got a lot of media publicity, a lot of community groups to support us. And we didn't get confirmation he was actually fired or removed from our store until maybe a month after that week that we went on strike. But we knew by the second day, once they removed him, pending the investigation, they probably weren't going to bring him back. It wasn't going to look good. We had gathered at least a dozen testimonies of current and past workers of various experiences that they had with this guy, like inappropriately touching them or making comments.
Wow.
And so yeah, that's what started it. It was very localized and very specific to that store in our area. There was no like kind of plan or intention to build out a larger national Target worker organizing campaign. That it just sort of organically grew from the first action at our store, and then snowballed into doing similar actions at other stores up the East Coast. We actually had workers at a Baltimore store specifically call me at my store trying to find me because they heard about what we had done at our store, and wanted help doing something similar at theirs. So then I, collaborated with those workers at that store in Baltimore to do the same thing. And then there was actually another store in Baltimore that heard about that action, and then we did the same thing there. And so it just kind of snowballed from store-specific actions to largely go against abusive bosses. But we've been trying to push for larger demands and agitate for larger demands, but that requires a deeper level of organization, more resources and capacity than what we currently have. And so we want to make that transition into a more larger national organization that has the capacity to actually press Target on some of these like larger demands around things, like healthcare and paid vacation and maternity leave and some of these things that Target, like, they're not legally obligated to have to provide any of, but if we were organized and able to flex our power enough, could force them to make concessions on those kinds of a demand. So that's kind of where we're at. Still pretty small, informal network of Target workers, but we are Target workers who are doing this. It's not, there's no nonprofit behind this funding anything what we're doing. Sort of try to collaborate with one prior to Target Workers Unite going public, and it was just a headache the whole time. They had very different ideas and intentions of what we wanted to do, ultimately having to split from them. And that's when we, announced Target Workers Unite as a national organizing effort. We wanted to announce that we were an independent formation, that we could do this ourselves as Target workers. We didn't need a nonprofit with connections to Ford Foundation and Soros and all the big names of philanthropy to, fund and drive an organizing effort through Target.
Well, I got to say, so yours, TWU is basically a grassroots from the ground up thing that you guys have got going on, because like you said, you broke off from an existing entity. So I'm assuming any kind of funding or anything like that, you guys are all footing the bill yourselves just for the purpose of change, correct?
Yeah. I mean, everything that we've been doing has been coming out of our own wages that we get at Target, and then we'll do fundraisers and fundraising, and there's a lot of people out there who support what we're doing, and we'll be generous enough to pitch in some money to help us to keep going. Usually when there's like some sort of a strike action happening, and we do like some sort of a GoFundMe thing, there's a lot of energy and support for that sort of stuff, so it's pretty easy to raise funds. We've never organized a strike where, say, like 100 workers at a store all went out on strike and maintained the picket line for like a week. We've had like a dozen workers stage a strike action and maintain the picket line in front of the store entrances. And it's not like a huge impressive number, but it does have an impact. And just having workers near the store entrances making their case to the customers, you can see how it has an impact on you just see the faces of the customers. They're not used to retail workers confronting them about these sorts of issues. When we first did it at my store, a lot of them even went to try to go complain to management about us, to like try to report us, get us in trouble, but they don't realize under the National Labor Relations Act, that sort of activity is protected. Like there's a line. You can't like harass people. You can't physically like disrupt them from getting into the store, but you can be near the store entrance. You can have signs. You can chant. You can hand out leaflets. You can talk to people and engage them, make your case, tell them why they should, support a boycott at that store for a particular reason, like, support workers on strike, don't shop at this store right now. We're trying to get this boss who's abusive held accountable. And that can be pretty effective. A lot of folks respond pretty well to that. There's a lot of people who are just like Karens and don't care, and it's all about convenience. And if you're inconveniencing them, they're going to flip out.
Yep.
But it's also kind of fun to be in that situation where you can just challenge them on it and know you're not going to get in trouble, as long as you're not, like doing anything that would technically be illegal, when you don't lose your protections. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of this stuff is just kind of foreign to folks. Generally doesn't happen, especially in retail. There's not a lot of organizing happening. There's not a lot of strike activity happening. It's very low union density industry, just like the service sector in general, very high turnover. And there's only maybe UFCW is about the only union I can think of that would actually have representation in some of these places, and it's very few and far between. Maybe SEIU, but yeah, we've been independent from all them. There's a reason I've gone through the IWW for a lot of this stuff. I share the criticisms that they have of the bigger unions, tending to be sort of the stereotypes that the corporations sell them as when they do their anti-union speeches about third parties coming in, taking your money, not really doing much for you, adding more bureaucracy. A lot of that can tend to be true, in these unions. And even though we're seeing the whole Striketober, or Strikes Giving now, I think is what they're calling it, going into November, you still see, even within the uptick in strike activity, that there's a very strong struggle between the rank and file union members of these unions and then the union leadership. Locally where we were at, we had a big strike with Volvo trucks and UAW. The UAW local president consistently kept trying to undermine the strike and getting it to end as quickly as possible, and trying to push crappy deals onto the rank and file, and the rank and file kept voting it down, and it was just like known even before the strike happened that there was like the union leadership tends to be closer to the management of these companies and viewing them as friends rather than as adversaries. And that's why the IWW uses the term business unionism a lot of the times to describe the character of these mainstream unions, that they don't really believe in this idea of like class struggle, or like, the workers and the bosses are entirely at odds with one another, economically speaking. Like, they don't share the same interests, right? Like, workers want to get as much as we can for as little work as possible. Bosses want to get as much work from you as possible for as little pay as possible. And those two things conflict, right? There's an antagonism there. IWW like makes it very clear that there's a recognition of that antagonism. There's a few other unions out there that do that too, like UNI. They have a pamphlet out now called "Them and Us Unionism," which making the same kind of argument. But generally, most of the unions don't want to have that recognition, right? They think the success of the corporation is to the benefit of the workers, and that the success of the corporation means success for workers. But obviously, it's sort of like the idea of trickle down economics, right? Like, if the rich are doing well, then we'll all do well because they'll let the wealth trickle down, right? But really,
that's not that hasn't worked yet.
Yeah, it just trickles up, right? Like, it just stays. They just concentrate at the top, and that's maybe one of the good things about the labor shortage, right? Is it's forced the employers, although not that much, to have to like concede and try to offer more pay, more benefits, right? Target is very good about making it seem like they're offering something more when they really offer just kind of the bare minimum. They've announced how they're going to like give free college tuition for all workers who want it, and this is coming off of like Walmart making a similar announcement, or Amazon making a similar announcement. But then they don't tell you like the details, like, well, it's only select degrees, it's at this like one online university, and it's all things that would, it's going to benefit Target as a corporation. Like, if they're thinking about training up their workforce, right? It's not like they're saying, oh yeah, we're going to pay for you to get a degree in anthropology, wherever you want to go, right?
Right.
It's just like very limited in what they offer. But yeah, so even though like the labor shortage has forced the employers to sort of have to offer more, they're still like not offering enough clearly to entice enough people in to stop the labor shortage, right?
Right.
Like, if they offered more pay, they offered more benefits, at a certain point, the supply is going to match the demand. But it just remains like a lot of the employers still aren't offering an enticing wage or benefits to get workers to come back to work these jobs. And that's true at Target as well.
Speaking of that, so kind of going into like the timeline of, when you really started, popping into the press and whatnot, there was an article in CNBC in May of 2020, and you had said that hourly wage workers have been forced to make an impossible choice during the coronavirus pandemic: skip their paycheck or risk getting sick. Having said that, have you seen any change in that regarding Target specifically?
No, it's still the same dynamic. That was the norm before the pandemic too, right? Like, there's no paid sick leave. It's not mandated. It's not guaranteed. For Target, you have to be basically full-time to qualify for that. And we got a guy who's been there since the store even opened in our area like 22 years ago, and he still doesn't have any paid sick leave. He has vacation, but he has no paid sick leave. So, I mean, the fact that that's the norm, that's the standard, you're telling people, yeah, you have to choose between making money or getting sick, or like coming in sick and potentially spreading your sickness to other people, right? I think about that all the time, like how I can't afford to miss a single shift. I have to work every single shift that I'm scheduled to be able to stay afloat and meet all my costs of living, my bills, and all that. And yeah, like, I don't feel like I have any real breathing room from working during this pandemic. I've asked my coworkers a lot, from the start of the pandemic to now, like, do people feel like they're better off financially? And I think a lot of people still have resentment that there were a lot of folks out there who were able to, get unemployment and were making more money on unemployment than we were working, close to full time during the whole pandemic. And nothing against the people who got the unemployment. I'm glad they did, and I wish that was like available to everybody, even right now. But the point being is we're just not compensated enough as so-called like essential workers, and that hasn't changed at all. And I think we all are still, having to make that choice of like, not wanting to go in to risk exposure, but still having to go in to make the money and to pay the bills because there's no one coming to cover that for you.
Right. All right. When Target was made aware of like the efforts in your store and whatnot, were there any kind of methods that they tried to use to kind of quote unquote quell the organization?
Well, when we first did an action at my store back in 2017, they were very confused about what our intentions were. They thought that we were like sent in by unions, and this was like some sort of a, backdoor way of trying to unionize. So then they tried to run an anti-union campaign, which was funny because like we weren't trying to unionize. That wasn't our goal. And like, even though we did have support from some of the local unions on our picket line, having local union members from around the area, from Volvo, from Kroger with UFCW, they just assumed by extension we had to be like plants from one of these unions sent in to do this, and we're trying to unionize. So then they try to run the anti-union campaigns, doing what they call captive audience meetings, where all the workers are forced to sit in and have these meetings where they just tell you, like basically try to intimidate workers to think like if they vote in a union, they're going to close the store down. You're going to lose your job. You don't want a union to come in. That, like I was saying earlier about the stereotypes when they run anti-union campaigns, like, oh, a third party comes in, takes your money, doesn't give you anything in return, more bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. So they try to do that. They try to like slander us and like defame our character, and like would look at comments that were happening on social media pages when we did updates on the strike and stuff. Because there were some workers in the store who were like hostile to what we were doing, and they would like make it a point of trying to troll like the updates we were providing on social media. But the managers were like reading all these comments, and then they would read them back to the workers to try to make it seem like we were trying to say how we were like silencing and censoring and deleting target workers' comments on these things, even though we were target workers. They were just like really trying to go after our character and refer to us as the strikers. But I think they understood at a certain point, like we weren't part of any union, and we weren't trying to run a union election campaign. And to me, it was more so about like, could we exercise our rights to organize outside of the context of having a formal union, and could we demonstrate that successfully to other workers who otherwise have, no experience doing this sort of a thing, right? Like, not even the union people in our area knew that workers who are not in a union had a right to strike. They only had a frame of reference of labor law within the context of a union already established in a workplace, so they hadn't no real familiarity with what we were doing in terms of being non-union workers, organizing a strike action, forming like an informal workers committee, and putting forward some demands and stuff like that. Like a lot of folks are just not used to that idea. Even the anti-union companies they have out there that get contracted by someone like Target or Walmart, when they try to run union campaigns, they're very used to this formula that's just become the standard now. When unions try to come in and organize somewhere, what they do is they'll get 30% of the workers at a workplace to sign authorization cards, meaning that the union can be the official bargaining agent for those workers at that particular workplace. Mm-hmm. Then they send those cards to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which enforces the National Labor Relations Act. The board certifies all the signatures, triggers an NLRB election, and then that's when they would actually finally vote in to have a union. And then, whether or not they win the vote, then it goes to a process of trying to negotiate the first contract. So this is like the process and the procedure that all the mainstream unions go through, how the corporations respond to any kind of organizing effort. So when you don't follow that formula or that model, they don't really know how to respond to what you're doing. That's why they ran an anti-union campaign in response to what we did to hold this abusive boss accountable. Because they thought, well, if someone's going to put in this effort and do all this, it's clearly to have a unionization campaign, right? Like we must be sent by the UFCW, must be a paid organizer to do this, right? But we made it, we're very, very careful to not give any control over to any of the unions that were in our area, and not let them dictate what we were going to do. It was very clear, like telling them, like, here's what we're going to do. If you want to be there to support us, great. If not, that's fine too.
So you really kind of threw a curveball toward it all, because it was so, grassroots from the ground up. It didn't fit any kind of model they could attack.
Yeah. And that's, I attribute that again to the IWW organizer training. That's the orientation you get when you go through the training is, like, it's up to you and your coworkers to get anything done to address the issues you're having in your workplace. It's not up to some third-party business union to come in and tell you how to do that. You don't need to rely on them to tell you what to do. Granted, I know they got resources and lawyers and all this other stuff, but they have a very particular way of doing things, and a lot of times, like, you as the worker don't really have much agency or control in what's done during all that. And that's been a lot of the struggle that, these rank and file workers in these unions have been having with their leaderships during all these strikes that have been happening, as leadership tries to force a bad contract on these workers and they keep having to vote it down. And at a certain point, workers just get tired because it's hard maintaining a strike in the picket line. Like, you have a reduction in wages, the strike fund is not going to match what you would normally be getting paid if you were actually working and not on strike. So it's a good way to just like starve people out, if the strike fund is not matching what normal pay rate would be. And the leadership is constantly like trying to find ways to force terms on you that you may not want, but it's just hard having to keep fighting that off. So yeah, we weren't operating like that. That's intentional. And yeah, so after that happened, I definitely got pretty irritated. There was like several what they call unfair labor practice charges or unfair labor practices by management towards me and other workers who are participating in this. The management can't legally give you the impression that they can't like threaten you, they can't interrogate you, they can't make promises or spy on you in relation to you exercising your rights to organize. So like threaten, they can't give you the impression that you're going to get in trouble if you don't do something they don't want you to do. Like, we were standing near that store entrances, right? Like trying to let customers know about, hey, here's this, we had these giant sandwich boards on us, right? And it has the picture of the boss, it has his face and his name, like we said, fire Daniel Butler with his face on it, and we're making the case like, this guy's an abuser, we need him out of here. We're engaging customers coming into the store over it, and management obviously didn't like it, right? So they're trying to discourage us from doing what we were legally allowed to do. But they came out and told us, like, you need to get away from the store entrances. If you don't, we're going to have to inform corporate, right? That's them making this vague threat that we're going to get in trouble if we don't listen to what they're doing. So that's one unfair labor practice that they engaged in. Another time was I was trying to invite coworkers to the labor rights meetings, just talking to them in passing when I'm on the sales floor, and letting them know about this event coming up. Just want people to know about these, what's labor rights and what management can and cannot do legally, and how do you defend yourself, all this sort of stuff that people generally are not familiar with. But one worker who was very pro-management decided to like narc on me essentially, and told management that I was like inviting workers to these meetings, right? So then management decided to pull me in the office and start asking me questions about it and like telling me I can't do it, that I'm soliciting, but that was technically a violation and unfair labor practice as well. Because it gets a little technical in terms of what constitutes solicitation and what doesn't. Like, I wasn't physically handing out a piece of paper to someone, like a flyer or anything like that. I was just like talking to someone, and having a discussion with them. And as long as, your boss, this is all in the private sector, by the way, not like public sector, there is a little bit different laws. But as long as your bosses aren't restricting your speech, if you're talking about other non-work things like sports or whatever, they can't restrict your speech when you're talking about like organizing or workplace conditions or wages or anything, and they can't give you the impression you're not allowed to do that, right? So anyways, yeah, they pulled me in the office, start giving me the impression I'm not allowed to do this, right? That's an unfair labor practice charge. So there were like several instances of this happening not long after they did like the captive audience meetings and trying to like defame us for our strike action and all that stuff. And so we just file the charges with the National Labor Relations Board. They do an investigation. With that stuff, like there's not that much of a penalty behind it. It costs the corporation a bunch of money because they have to hire law firms to handle these investigations and process it and all that stuff. But in terms of like if there's financial penalties or anything like that, there's not really any of that. Even if there's merit found to the unfair labor practice, what ends up happening is you get a settlement and it gets posted in the workplace that says, the company will no longer violate your rights in these particular instances or ways that these, your rights were violated. And so that's about the extent of what they do. It's good, I think, to have it on like the public record that the company does violate our labor rights, especially a company like Target that takes so much effort into being seen as a progressive, woke employer. But yeah, the law itself and the NLRB does not have much power to like, penalize the companies from violating your rights to organize, but that doesn't mean you can't organize. And I think a lot of what we've been trying to do here is show people that you can do this and you're not just going to get fired and you can't have any kind of success doing this. People tend to think like you're never going to win trying to organize a Fortune 500 company like this. They'll just fire you and just get rid of you. The laws aren't like won't protect you, blah blah blah. And while there's like some truth to those ideas, like I always just like to point to what we've been doing these last several years. Like I don't consider myself an exceptional individual, right? Like the most education I have is a high school diploma, but like you still can utilize what rights we do have to organize and use them in a strategic way to get things done. And maybe Target is a particular instance where we get more leniency on this sort of thing of, not having to worry about getting retaliated on or not than other employers. Again, largely because I think Target does want to be seen as this very progressive company that is not hostile to its employers and is woke or whatever.
As far as that goes, that thing with Target. So I want to get your opinion on this because, I saw where, you started getting some press and stuff, pretty hardcore in the pandemic around, May of 2020. All right. And then I found this article today from February of 2021, and I want to see if you agree with this statement. It was from HR Drive. And it said Target said it has recently worked to demonstrate gratitude to employees various ways. In July, it raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, waived attendance policies for COVID-related illness, free access to virtual health care, and free backup care. Do you feel this would have happened without the threat of organizing?
I don't want us to take credit for something that it seems kind of dubious if we could take credit for it or not. I do think we've had a role, I think we were a certain pressure, applying a certain amount of pressure that that maybe have helped get us certain concessions that we wouldn't have got otherwise. I definitely think a lot of the credit just goes to the pandemic, and maybe the fear of like workers, like if they don't offer enough, that workers would just revolt or they'll just leave. I think a lot of Americans' capacity for resistance these days is more like a passive resistance, like with the Great Resignation. It's not so much this point where American workers are ready to do a general strike where we all go on strike and shut everything down and take over the whole metropolises or whatever. It's more so like we just are going to refuse to work and do some sort of passive resistance like that. So I think that's the force Target's contending with, and I think we're relatively small, but I do think we punch above our weight. And I think like even just the most recent thing with holiday pay and the wage increases, the raises, I think some of that can be attributed to our hazard pay campaign we've been pushing the last few months to try to get a $2 hazard pay instituted, just universally across all Target jobs. We sort of have now gotten there with like my store, they just announced we are bumped to $16.25 from $15. And then we get the holiday pay, which granted it's only on the weekends, but it's an additional $2 on the weekends, like during this fourth quarter period. So yeah, I don't think we necessarily would have gotten any of those things if it wasn't for us like agitating around that. And I think we could do a lot more if we just had a little bit more formal organization and a little bit more buy-in from workers. But I think it's just what we're asking people to do is still pretty foreign and unfamiliar and uncomfortable, because I think people generally want the path of least resistance. And which is why I say, like, I think American workers' proclivity now is more so of a passive resistance rather than an active one. Going on a strike is a very active form of resistance. And most workers have never been on strike in their lives. It's one thing I found out when we organized some of the ones at these different stores. There was like a 65-year-old black man, and Baltimore has a very strong like labor history there. But this guy, 65-year-old black man, had never been on a strike before in his entire life. And I think that is kind of just speaks to where a lot of workers' experiences are and mindset. And I think now with the pandemic and everything, people are maybe more receptive to that idea, but like they haven't really had the experience with it. And the only people who really have are already in the established unions. But then they're having to contend with this whole other beast of, what I've already sort of touched on is, how the leadership of these unions oftentimes will collaborate with the bosses to push bad contracts on the workers. And then the workers have to struggle against not just their bosses, but also against the union officials.
Right.
And so then there's that aspect of it. Whereas where we're coming from right now, it's like there isn't that labor bureaucracy we got to deal with now. It's more so like we got to deal with a bunch of workers who don't necessarily see the importance or necessity of like organizing and taking action and having that kind of orientation or approach to things. It's just not. It's not a cultural standard. It's not a norm. It's not something people are educated on. Most people don't even know that the NLRB exists or the NLRA exists or what that means. People have a lot of quote unquote common sense notions about like right to work laws or at will employment laws. A lot of times you hear that thrown around to mean like, well, you don't have the right to strike or the right to organize. Your boss can just get rid of you at any time for any reason. And so there's just this very strong kind of defeatist mentality I think a lot of workers have when it comes to all this stuff. And it's not to say, again, like, the laws are not that favorable for workers, but we still have the right to strike and the right to organize. And a lot of the reason that hasn't been employed within organized labor is because the unions have actually signed away those rights a lot of times in these contracts. They sign no strike clauses. So for the length of a 4 or 5 several year long contract, the workers are not legally allowed to strike. They could be fired and kicked out by their union if they try to. It's what a wildcat strike is when the workers decide to strike anyways against the union and the company. But yeah, so it's just like trying to wage a kind of a cultural battle in a lot of ways with workers to get them to understand why it's important to do this. But the pandemic, I definitely think, has helped like kind of open up a door in a lot of ways to make that argument for workers. It just needs to be done a lot more thoroughly and a lot more comprehensively, I think, by people who are like trying to organize. So that's, one of the things we're trying to do. But we just got to get our act together a little bit more to have more of an impact.
Gotcha. Going back to the whole Target, the holiday pay bump, can you clarify? Yeah. Can you clarify to me, because they had this whole thing on CNBC in October talking about this mess, and it says that it runs from November 20th to December 19th, and like you said, only includes weekends, Christmas Eve, and the day after Christmas. But it also says supply chain employees, and I assume that means like receiving and stock crews, because the way they put it in the article was opening boxes and getting product to the shelves, and that was for 2-week periods between October 10th and December 18th, and there were no specifics reported for that at all. And also, before we clarify that, and I'd said this online, so just for you guys watching, if you haven't been following this, Target said in this article, the big box retailer previously said it would scale back holiday hiring and give more hours to its staff. And I would just like to say that sounds like a really good cover for the fact they can't hire anybody and they're going to increase the workload on their current staff. Adam, your thoughts?
No, that's definitely what it is. I think we've alluded to before, Target is really good about spinning these sorts of things. Like just taking the reality that there's a labor shortage, right? Because the job isn't enticing to bring enough people in, and somehow turning it into a positive, right? Spinning it into a positive that, oh yeah, we can't offer enough pay and benefits to entice people to come in, but that just means we'll offer overtime for the current workers. So yeah, we'll get worked harder. And that was, that was the struggle even before the pandemic. They started trying to roll out this process called modernization, which was all about trying to increase productivity per worker, making each worker more responsible for many different tasks around the store and shaking up the whole design and structure of the workflow and everything like that.
Oh, you mean increase workload with no pay?
Yeah. Well, but they would say, well, yeah, we're increasing the pay, right? Because they had this thing called Pathway to 15. When I first got hired on in 2017, they made the announcement that they're going to bump our pay to 15 by 2020, right? But then, conveniently the pandemic happens, and then Target says, well, actually, we're going to call that hazard pay, the 15, even though we promised that 3 years ago. And, they've been riding that one for a while, saying like, oh yeah, we offer competitive pay. We offer 15. We were one of the first to announce the Pathway to 15 or whatever, even, but then they say it's hazard pay at the same time. That was another big point of frustration for us is like claiming they were offering more pay than they really weren't. But now with the labor shortage and inflation and all that stuff, and I think a little bit of a pressure campaign from calling for an actual $2 additional hazard pay, we now got a lot of we got that holiday pay, and then we got a raise, and they've been there's variations of raises from store to store and region to region. I've heard $2 pay bumps at some stores in the cities. We got a $1.25 pay bump at our store. But they all are getting that $2 holiday pay, and I think that goes to the distribution centers too. So when they're saying supply chain workers, I believe they're referring to the distribution centers beyond just the stores.
With your knowledge of the labor issues, I mean, like how labor law works and stuff like that, I'm curious, do you, in your location, I'm sure, have there been instances of where they've hired in new hires at a higher rate of pay than people that are already there? And how have you as a group approached trying to rectify that and getting a proportional bump?
We haven't had much success on that issue. We know it's an issue because a lot of the older workers who've been there for 10, 20 years always feel salty about the fact there's these people coming straight in off the streets, getting the same pay as they have, even though they've been there 5, 10 years. They definitely don't feel that their experience and knowledge is valued when that happens. I think generally, though, as a principle, it's good to have kind of a flat pay rate where you have the highest wage possible for everybody rather than creating a tiered system. There should be some sort of a compensation, some sort of seniority pay. We get that demand a lot from the older veteran workers. If you look at on our website, we have this target worker platform. That's one of the things that's incorporated in there is this demand for a seniority pay. But I also think it's important to understand that you don't want to create tiered wage systems either, because you could see how that's been used by these companies, largely in these already organized, unionized workplaces, as a way to create division between the workers, between older workers and newer workers, because you end up with newer workers who will never get the same pay or benefits as the older workers. The older workers get phased out at a higher pay and compensation, while the newer workers will never be able to get that. And so the effect that has is it causes the newer workers, younger workers, to feel salty towards the older workers, and feeling like, well, why is this person who's doing the same job beside me getting paid $5 more than me, and I'm never going to get that same level of pay and compensation? It really undermines solidarity amongst workers on the job. So a lot of what's actually been happening with these strike actions this year has been fighting against the two-tier wage system, where they're trying to say, well, we don't actually want a two-tier wage system. We want younger workers to be able to get the same level of pay and benefits as the older workers, but at the same time having a certain seniority pay or compensation in there for the older workers who are already there. So that's something we want to make headway on, but haven't been able to do much with that. A lot of our efforts these last year or two has just been so focused on COVID and safety, and PPE and stuff like that. A lot of workers, I think, have sort of moved beyond the pandemic and don't think it's that big of a deal anymore. I think they feel more so reminded of it because we have to wear masks working our shifts, and it's just seen as like a hindrance or an annoyance or an inconvenience for a lot of workers, although I think it's worth wearing the masks. And I think folks just feel like they're ready to move and get this beyond themselves, right? Like put this behind us, even though like it's not that easy, right?
Right.
I think that's where a lot of worker sentiments are, for better or worse. So yeah, I mean, we have that target worker platform, and that's a lot of what we'll go back to try to push for, better jobs, better compensation, whatever at Target in general. But I think a lot of these issues with the pandemic and everything are still going to be affecting us for a while,
right?
And still be relevant.
Got a comment in the chat that I think is worth discussing here. Alki, who is next week's guest, he said new hires get paid $2 to $3 more than workers who's been at my employer for 5 years. No one knew until they started talking about their wages. And speaking of talking about wages, in your experience and whatnot, is there any legal grounds whatsoever for an employer to terminate employees for discussing their pay?
The strongest case that I've heard of is employers trying to get their workers to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, saying that they're not going to discuss those things. But I know that that's been successfully challenged under the banner of the National Labor Relations Act as well. It's just, when you start relying on that particular law, you have to do certain things to qualify for it to apply, right? Like you can't just complain about things, right? The definition of what's called protected concerted activity is the term you'll hear a lot in reference to all this. The definition of that was more broadly applied before Trump came in and installed the labor board that he wanted. After he came in, there were some decisions that the Trump labor board made that narrowed that how broadly that term can be applied. Like before the Trump board, it sort of could be argued that just complaining was considered protected concerted activity, like an act of organizing. But now you have to be a little more explicit in it. Like you can't just complain or gripe. You have to be like putting forward some sort of a demand. You have to be making it clear that you're like organizing with your coworkers, acting on their behalf. You can't just be doing it on your behalf as an individual. So I just say these things, like if you're going to start doing it, you want to know how to make a solid legal case, because even if you know your rights and you're going by the book, that doesn't mean your boss knows them or cares to follow them, at least initially. So they still may violate your rights, okay? And you may get fired, but you could at least go and make your case with the NLRB that you were wrongfully terminated for exercising your rights, so long as you've executed them properly. And this is actually where the NLRB has the most power, is they can actually determine that your termination was wrong or incorrect or illegal and mandate to that employer that you get your job back and you get back pay from the date of the wrongful termination to the date of the ruling, which usually takes several months. It's not that long of a process, but it also can drag out, you know. Unfortunately, a lot of times workers can't just wait around for several months to get back pay from when they were wrongfully terminated. They move on and get another job. So when the NLRB makes their decision and says, yeah, you can have your job back and here's the back pay, they've already gotten another job, so they don't want to go back to that job, right? Unless they're just like a really dedicated organizer and they want to keep organizing it, right? Most workers are just going to move on because that's just kind of the American worker mentality at this point is, if you don't like it, quit, right?
In relation to the NLRB, Target, and I'm just curious, how does the NLRB handle situations where companies, as a condition of employment, ask you to sign an arbitration agreement? And did Target have an arbitration agreement?
I don't remember ever having to sign any sort of arbitration agreement. I'm sure the higher up you go in the company, there's probably more that stipulates that sort of a thing. But then you also probably don't have protection. Like you're less likely to have protection or be qualified as protected under the NLRA as well. But the company can try to set all sorts of terms that they want, but the NLRB still gets to, they have to like go through and decipher, like, are those terms in violation of the National Labor Relations Act? You know, you'll see this happen a lot of times with how they classify certain workers as management versus non-management. A lot of times there's a gray area there where they want people to be seen as management or a supervisor, but they're actually not. And so they'll, you know, like at Target, you know, for instance, they come up with these terms called team leads, which are supposed to be people who usually are managers or in the management team, but they have actually a few positions at our store where they call certain positions team leads, but they're not management, right? But that's up to the NLRB to have to like go through how is the company classifying this and what like guidelines does the NLRB have to determine, like, you know, is this policy in violation of the NLRA or not? That happens. You know, it's not that uncommon to happen. Target actually had to revise its employee handbook because it was given the impression that workers weren't allowed to organize in one version of their employee handbook. In terms of like arbitration, that's the only thing I could really think of is like they have it very clearly spelled out in their employee handbook, like what is the process for being disciplined and legally terminated from Target. They have to make that clear to employees to know, and they can't like violate their own process in that, right? Which, you know, that's one of the things we check in with workers too when they want to organize is like, you got to know, do you have any infractions on your record? Like for Target, it says they can terminate you if you've had 3 infractions on your record within a 12-month period. that's the policy. They made that known. That's the employee handbook. They're not like hiding that from you. That also means they can't circumvent that policy either. They can't just arbitrarily make up a new policy and decide that they're going to apply it. Like, they have to stick to that. If they don't stick to it, then you have legal grounds to say, well, you're violating your own arbitration process, right?
Right.
But that gives you some, like for me, for instance, they tried to discipline me once when I tried to invite a coworker to a labor rights event. But because I argued that was an unfair labor practice, that they were even considering that, that was expunged from my record, and I've had no infractions on my record ever since I've been there for 4 years. And I know that's hard for people to maintain, but when you're organizing, it's like you got to just be a model worker and do your job and be on time, because if you can give them a legal ground to discipline you and terminate you, then you can't argue, well, this is because I was organizing. It's just like, no, you were late and you were a bad worker, and they can legally get rid of you for those things.
Right.
Versus like, they can't say, well, we're firing you because you said you wanted to organize coworkers for a higher wage. Like, that would be blatantly illegal for them to do. But if you're like consistently late and you're not doing your job, you're not meeting the terms that you've agreed to being hired at the job, right? Like, they can legally discipline you and legally terminate you based on the arbitration process that they've already gone through with you, right?
Yep.
So that's why you got to know that stuff. And a lot of people just kind of like, they're not really paying attention to it, right? And a lot of people don't want to pay this level of detail to their jobs and the legality of it all either. And I get it, but it really helps that you have this mindset that you're constantly building your legal case when you're at work. I know for me, it makes me a little bit neurotic because I'm constantly thinking like, am I being watched? What's being recorded? Having to watch my demeanor, my behavior, like constantly worrying about all these things. But like that's just the reality of like, if you want to organize as a worker in this country, that's just what you got to do.
Yeah.
For better or worse.
So I got to say, this has been absolutely fascinating and extremely enlightening. I really do appreciate you being here. There was something that was in the chat early on that I haven't had a chance to get to yet for you. Mariah Karen says, I have to say thank you for showing everybody that it can be done with proper planning and work. I think that, what you guys have done, like you said, with not having like official union affiliation and whatnot, every little stride that you make is important because you're doing it on your own. And I think that is something to damn well be proud of. That's for sure. The one thing I want to do before we go, though, if there is one message you can give to anybody that's watching now or that's going to be listening later, about, organizing a workforce, what would you want their one takeaway to be?
Don't be afraid to do it, especially now with the labor shortage. This is like the best time to be trying to put demands out there and win them. Reach out to the IWW to get organizer training if you want to get yourself prepared. But you're not going to know how to do it until you actually go out and try and do it. And just, don't be afraid to take risks.
Now, in the future, if you guys are needing funding and whatnot, do people go to the Target Workers Unite website? Is that where any information will be?
Yeah, you can go there. Twitter, we probably tend to keep the most up to date. We do have a general strike fund going right now. There had been talks of potentially doing something going into this fourth quarter. So we want to be prepared if we do. Every time we've done any sort of strike action, we've always made sure to compensate any workers their lost wages as a result of going on strike. And we want to keep that as a standard. So any help in donating to our general strike fund would go towards that end and be greatly appreciated.
Awesome. Well, Adam, I hope you had a good time. This is great. Like I said, this has been a fascinating conversation because, being in the Southeast, that's why tonight and then Wednesday as well is going to be kind of important to a bunch of us Southerners because we don't have a lot of this education down here. We don't hear a lot about this. And, it's about as anti-union organization country as there can be. So thank you for your insight. You obviously, you know what you're talking about, and you're doing a really, really good thing for your people.
Right on. Thanks for having us on here. I hope I wasn't getting too buried in the details for y'all.
No, I enjoyed it. I loved it. That's like I said, it's fascinating. My only experience with organizing and strikes is my father worked for Bell South, telecommunications. And, they were union. And I remember a couple of times, that he went on strike, and, that was a situation where, he had to run out and get like a job at a warehouse just so he had, money coming in to make sure he didn't violate the strike. So that's my only familiarity with it. And that only happened, I think, twice in my lifetime. And, I'm 51, so that's been a long time ago. So, all this kind of information is great for all of us that don't get to be around it or witness it or just see it on the news or whatnot. So, but once again, thank you for being here. If you guys have something big coming up soon or whatnot, let me know, and we'll give you another night where you're just dedicated. We'll dedicate it to that, whatever you guys need. So, but, like I said, thank you for being here.
Sure. Have a good night.
You as well, everybody. The podcast audio will be up, probably sometime around 11:30 or whatnot. It'll be there, and then Wednesday night we'll have Alki on, and we'll have some more union talk, and it's going to be kind of cool. So, everybody, thanks for showing up, and thanks for your support, and we will see you guys next time.